So, welcome back. I'm now very happy to introduce our first keynote lecturer and our first keynote lecturer, Lars Coenen, from Western University in Norway. This is a public event, so there are a few people, a few extra people here from IRS and from the Leibniz Association. So welcome also to our guests to join us for the public part of the Spring Academy. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Lars Coenen to you. Lars is a professor in innovation and sustainability transitions at the Mohn Center for Innovation and Regional Development, Western Norway University of Applied Sciences. Lars is an economic geographer by training, and his main interest is in innovation processes, I would say, and on the spatial conditions of innovation. So Lars has published a lot of wonderful articles on the regional foundations of innovations, but also on innovation-driven regional development. Before he moved to Norway, he used to be a research group leader at CIRCLE, which is an acronym for Center for Innovation, Research and Competence in the Learning Economy at Lund University. I think CIRCLE does no longer exist, or it still exists, but it has shrunken.
It's the Center for Innovation Research. So the abbreviation wasn't terrible, and they changed that.
Okay, so. And then from 2017 to 2020, Lars moved to Melbourne, and he became a City of Melbourne inaugural chair of Resilient Cities. And then he moved back to Europe and became professor in Norway. Lars is internationally known for his pioneering research on the geography of environmental innovation and sustainability transitions. So he's no longer interested in any kind of innovation, but in particular kinds of innovation. So innovation that have a societal value. And we had a wonderful workshop in Gelsenkirchen a couple of months ago where this intersection of valuation studies and innovation studies was a huge issue. And also, I think it's not an exaggeration to say that he also introduced space into transition studies. I would say that was one of your pioneering works. He has published widely in the most reputable journals of our domain and is also a highly cited colleague. But at the same time, and this is particularly interesting for the Spring Academy, I think he has always worked at the intersection of academic research and political and societal practice, and also in different national and institutional contexts. So this is really a huge treasure of experience, and we are looking forward that you're now sharing a little bit of it with us. So I'm really looking forward to listening to you, Lars, and welcome.
Thanks, Oliver. That was a really nice introduction. And hi, everyone. It's great to be here, and to be here for a couple of days. So we have hopefully plenty of time to continue the conversation around transdisciplinarity and space. Indeed, I'm going to talk about geographies of sustainability transitions. And when I kindly received the invitation, I was thinking I'm also going to use it a bit for therapeutic ends, self-therapeutic ends, because I wanted to use this talk also partly to reflect a bit on especially the period where I worked as the City of Melbourne Chair of Resilient Cities, which was very much a position that was boundary spanning between science, policy and practice. And as Suntje was already alluding to earlier today, involved a lot of ambiguity. So I'll be talking later on today about living labs, about experimentation, and I'll have actually quite a few kind of critical reflections on that as well, which should be situated perhaps in the context where I was working at that time, which was in Melbourne, Australia, and at a time also where the climate politics were very, very fierce. Generally, my interests have been around innovation. I'm indeed trained as a geographer, but only quite late. So I did a PhD in geography, but before that, I was an engineer. I was doing innovation studies, science technology studies, and then made it into geography. And that was, in a sense, a very formative moment, because geography gave me, as sort of an interdisciplinary scholar, at least some sort of ontology and epistemology to think about, what concepts can I combine and which can I not combine. Because I think, the worst version of transdisciplinarity is anything goes. I strongly want to argue against that. But also speaking on the theme of innovation, I think that also relates to transdisciplinarity, because innovation is all about how ideas get realized and are materialized into products, technologies, organization, how they become real, so to say. So indeed, when I was doing my PhD and postdoc and later on, I've always been very interested in sort of what conditions novelty creation, what conditions innovation, and particularly what spatial factors condition innovation, in what places do people, do firms sort of find an environment where they are incentivized, stimulated to innovate. I'm still very interested in that, but I become more interested also not just in the kind of the conditions for innovation, but also the impact of innovation. And that partly reflects perhaps also where we are at the moment in time. When I was starting my academic work, everybody was very enthusiastic about innovation. And there was a lot of optimism around sort of all the human ingenuity and creativity that goes into innovation. And we were sort of in the middle of an ICT kind of boom, revolution. And if I fast forward to the present, I sense more skepticism and sometimes outright sort of opposition against a lot of innovation, notably in the climate space, where people are also questioning, do we all have to, change to electric vehicles, abandon our car, start moving it with public transport, refurnish our houses? And there's sort of a growing skepticism and resistance, I guess, mobilizing against innovation. I think that's very interesting. So I don't think we, as innovation scholars, can sort of just limit ourselves to looking at what conditions innovations, but we have to really also start thinking about what does innovation really do in terms of shaping our societies, in terms of shaping space. And I guess there we need to be a bit more reflective, because I think a lot of the field of and a lot of the theory around innovation, also geography innovation, has been very sort of pro-innovation. And that's why I'm trying to use it as a bridge to get to the topic of sustainability transitions, because I became very interested in that field exactly because it was more mindful of sort of the politics, the contestation, the resistance against innovation. And so to me that was a very sort of fruitful sort of endeavor into other disciplines. And in that journey, I guess I've also journeyed further into not just sort of other disciplines, but also engaging with other professions or with other knowledge systems. And especially in the years in Melbourne, working with bureaucrats, with politicians, with consultants, with citizens, and kind of, I will try to reflect a bit on the lessons of what happens when you engage with those actors when you start talking about innovation and about sustainability transitions or about transformations. Okay, that was a long introduction. So I want to sort of broadly sort of situate the talk in the field of sustainability transitions. And again, I became kind of interested in that concept basically because I wanted to move into, you know, environmental innovation. And it was right after my PhD, I was looking into things like clusters, regional innovation systems, you know, learning regions, all that. But there was sort of a growing interest and awareness rising about, well, we really need to start thinking and taking sort of the environmental crisis, the climate crisis serious. And on the back of that, we saw kind of growing interest in eco-innovation, environmental innovation, the emergence of so-called clean tech industries. And to me, sort of our existing theories, terminology around innovation did not really help to fully understand what was going on, to make sense of the emergence of green industries and green innovation. And that's how I kind of arrived in the field of sustainability transitions. And I'll explain that in a bit, but that was basically a field that very much sort of drew from different disciplines. But kind of core to the topic is that sustainability and sustainable development requires more than sort of technology optimization, quick fixes, sort of single sort of innovations. But it really sort of positions the challenge of sustainability and sustainable development as a system transformation or a system change, which means it's long-term, it's multidimensional, it's fundamental sort of change processes, where entire socio-technical systems sort of shift or innovate. So think about transport, think about energy, think about housing. It's a lot about not just kind of, you know, patches, incremental improvements in our sort of existing systems, but it's really about how do we transform the entire system. And this is kind of at the core of what this literature, this field tries to explain. Just to take the example, oh, I'm sorry, I was not supposed to move too much. Oh. How do I get the laser? Oh, here. Doesn't work. Oh, yeah, there. Thank you. There. You have to just turn it around. Right, so think about, you know, our transport system, the socio-technical system for transport is constituted by sort of the industry structure, but also market and user practices, culture, symbolic meaning, infrastructure, regulations, policies, fuel infrastructure, maintenance and distribution networks. And the idea with the sustainability transition is that it's not just about sort of changes within, say, the industry structure, but it is about how that system as a whole kind of adapts and changes towards more sustainable modes of production and consumption. Sort of that ambition has brought together a nowadays global epistemic community, which tries to understand the forces, factors, features associated with development of green innovations, but also sectoral transformations, and in recent years also what that sort of means for regional urban economies. So to first of all kind of explain the interdisciplinary sort of background of sustainability transitions, it basically sort of drew on here sort of the sort of more orthodox theories around innovation that were very much kind of looking at what generates innovation, right? Under what conditions does innovation happen? Looking at networks, at capabilities of firms, at university-industry relationships, at issues like, you know, what determines creativity, and so on and so on. in a sense, very much leaning on evolutionary economics, but combining that then also with social construction of technology, and in that sense, opening up also more for the politics of how new technologies, how innovation comes about, as well as institutional theory, to also sort of look at how norms, values, regulations, and so on kind of play a part in this, but also are part of that transformation process. This has led to a number of kind of key concepts, key frameworks within this literature. I'll focus primarily on the multi-level perspective and strategic niche management, and to some extent transition management. But what it has done to our understanding of innovation in the context of sustainability challenges is that it very much emphasizes that what kind of innovation is needed is disruptive innovation. It's not the kind of path-dependent incremental improvements. It is really about entirely new sort of technologies or new practices. And we can see that that is happening with, you know, the transition to renewables, that those are very disruptive technologies for our energy systems. But we could also see that in the field of food, in the field of transport, housing. Still, it takes this sort of systemic understanding of innovation, that innovation happens in a relational space. It's conditioned by institutions, by norms, values, regulations, and so on. But it also has adopted a more capacious understanding of innovation, not just about technological innovation, but also about new social practices, social innovation. It is opened up for innovation that is being pioneered by NGOs and grassroots movements, and it's starting to look at innovation in the public sector. So it has really sort of opened up what initially was a very Schumpeterian understanding of innovation. Innovation happens by entrepreneurs, happens in firms, happens in markets, but this literature looks at innovation in a broader sort of field. It's normative in the sense that it's a field that very much likes to look at innovation and also stimulate innovation to further sustainability, further sustainable development. And is also criticized for that, because a lot of sort of more traditional scholars in innovation studies would say that, you know, innovation studies is only about understanding, you know, what determines innovation. We don't need to think about sort of the, you know, the effects of innovation, and that kind of reveals partly that until very recently, innovation studies was very much dominated by economists. But also has opened up for the innovation process becoming increasingly contested. And that was particularly, say, starting 10, 20 years ago, that a lot of innovation in, say, renewable energy, a lot of innovation, you know, which was labeled sustainable, received a lot of pushback from incumbents, from established industries, and so on, or tried to sort of greenwash innovations and label them green, but without that sort of disruptive element. And finally, it has opened up for also thinking more reflexively about innovation. And that's something I want to really emphasize today, is not only about, you know, let's just kind of make sure that this innovation kind of is realized, but while doing that, also ask the question, so what really happens if this innovation, you know, mainstreams, becomes big, diffuses? The what-if question. And again, that has been a bit off the radar in conventional innovation studies. Now, I know this is we're a very diverse group, but within innovation studies, within sustainability science, but also within economic geography, the idea of sustainability transitions really picked up. It became very sort of prolific in terms of papers that were published on it. And a lot has to do with sort of the popularity of this model, the multi-level perspective on transitions, which originated from studies on the history of technology, and which is a model which tries to really explain technological revolutions. And sort of has demonstrated through these historical analysis that these technological revolutions kind of often played out in this kind of multi-level field, where, take for example, the transition from sailing to steamships, where for a long time you had a sort of a system in place that was very stable, and where different sort of institutional elements, policies, technologies, behavior were very sort of aligned, very kind of complementary to each other. And as a result of that stability, innovation was happening, but typically sort of innovation happened incrementally and stepwise. But sort of as seeds of those kind of transitions, those transformations, we find that sort of early on emergent sort of new innovations and technologies were sort of bubbling away in so-called niches. Protected spaces, they're also called, where sort of new technologies were being developed, were being exposed to usage, and which the model sort of then explains that if exogenous sort of factors allow for it, start to sort of destabilize this regime, and that's when sort of windows of opportunity open up for those emergent technologies, emergent innovations to not just emerge, but also to break through and challenge and sort of transform a regime. So this is a model that is very, very hopeful, because it basically projects a lot of agency to small, seemingly small sort of actions and small developments. And you know, in more contemporary analysis, you could apply this model, for example, on how the wind industry became big, how it grew from basically tinkering and experimentation by farmers, by small companies and entrepreneurs on the Danish countryside, but which over decades sort of evolved into a global industry with companies like Vestas and the global value chains that come with that. Now that sort of, that imagination about how transitions unfold has also really picked up among policymakers, and that kind of also partly speaks to perhaps one theme around transdisciplinarity. And again, I go now a little bit back to innovation studies, and how innovation studies early on caught the interest of policymakers, and how a lot of our thinking around why is innovation important, what does innovation do to economies, has been, in a sense, a transdisciplinary project co-created by policymakers and researchers. And a lot of people have also been very critical of that and said innovation studies is basically just sort of theory led by policy, right? So people have also said this is not, you know, rigorous science. But it kind of tells you a little bit about the sort of dilemmas also that you start to maneuver when you're co-creating in a sort of transdisciplinary space. And this is also happening, I guess, with notions like transitions, transformations. We see that it's being picked up by the OECD, it's being picked up by the European Union in the form of mission-oriented innovation and research policy. It's also now picked up by the IPCC. So the whole sort of transition model has become quite a dominant sort of theory of change, how we are supposed to achieve those sustainability transformations. And policymakers are, in a sense, important co-creators in sort of the theorizing how those processes unfold. But if you take sort of a more skeptical perspective on it, you could say, well, these are, in a sense, magic concepts. They are very broad, they're very normatively attractive, they're oriented to finding consensus, right? I think, again, the idea of innovation, also the idea of transition, kind of paints a picture where we could basically achieve a lot of sustainability imperatives, but while at the same time also having economic growth, or at least economic development, and in that sense sort of falls into the narrative of win-win-win. And it also has global marketability. So more critical social scientists have started to really also pick at and unpack, you know, these ideas of transitions and transformations as Ivy discourses. Very interesting paper by Linda Westman and Vanessa Castambroto in Antipode from 2022 makes the argument that, you know, there's a lot of sort of progressive, radical terminology in transition and transformation thinking, but they say it's still sort of very much sort of reproducing quite traditional, orthodox aims and notions of progress and development, and is cementing, in a sense, the status quo and its underlying norms and values. So I just wanted to flag for that even though there's a lot of sort of interest and sort of enthusiasm for transitions and transformation, it also has already received its fair share of very fair criticism. Now, where does sort of space and geography sort of feature in all this? A lot of the initial theorizing around transitions and how they unfold, and sort of the theory of change around the, you know, how sort of innovations emerge in niches and then sort of upscale and mainstream and sort of can change entire socio-technical regimes. A lot of that initial theorizing was developed in the Netherlands. And a lot of also the empirical work sort of just took sort of as its empirical field, you know, what is happening within particular countries. So a lot of the initial theories were aspatial and even suffered from methodological nationalism, in the sense that they always looked at, you know, what are the drivers and barriers to the emergence of wind turbine industry in the Netherlands or solar PV in Germany. So while a lot of geographers started to engage with these ideas of transition, they've also started to question sort of the lack of attention for space, the methodological nationalism in a lot of the theories, and, you know, started to question that sort of one of the mantras of the Dutch school of transition studies, that transitions can happen anywhere. But rather started to unpack, you know, so what are actually the spatial contingencies, the particularities, where those large disruptive transformations can happen. Looking at sort of, you know, what are sort of the institutions that are conducive to that? Has it something to do, for example, with the way that the private and the public sector relate and coordinate with each other? What capabilities are needed? They are not found everywhere, but we can find clusters, concentrations of industries in particular places. We see indeed that, you know, the geography of green industry is very uneven, and that has a lot to do with capabilities that were developed before they were turned green, but were actually sort of embedded and located in those places before they were sort of labeled green or green industries. the quality of the networks, the spatiality of those networks, but also the materiality, of course. A lot of green industries, green economies built on material resources. And interestingly, we see that a lot of those resources are found in typical sort of peripheries. And there's an interesting sort of field of research on whether those sustainability transitions actually are leading to reinforced resource peripheries in those places, right? Only extracting, so to say, raw material from many places in the global south, but also in places like northern Scandinavia, without necessarily adding so much value or sort of bringing a lot of value back to the local economy. What especially colleagues in Switzerland, Christian Binz and Bernhard Truffer, has shown is that when you want to explain sort of how these green industries, these green sectoral transformations unfold, it is really stupid to just focus on one country, because it's typically something that happens on a global scale, unevenly, but if you really want to understand those dynamics, you have to sort of follow the network wherever it takes you. But in that sense, sort of what a lot of sort of human geography, economic geography has done is basically just sort of spatializing existing theories and existing concepts from transition studies. And that is kind of a proven concept or a proven recipe for a lot of geographers. We take theories and concepts from other related social sciences, and we sort of add a spatial perspective to them. However, geography has also sort of added some methodological renewal by doing more comparative case studies of transitions, but also really adding quantitative analysis to this. Particularly sort of work within evolutionary economic geography started to quantify sort of what are the capabilities needed for those sustainability transitions, looking at how those capabilities are distributed across all regions in Europe, for example, and finding that where regions have specialized in green industries, green economies, has often sort of had a legacy from industries that were quite brown, were quite polluting. And finally, and I think that's where I will sort of pick up and try to do a bit more of a deep dive into transdisciplinarity, a lot of sort of convergence also happened between transition studies and geographers in terms of doing action research and transdisciplinary research, living labs. And that has a lot to do with, say again, the normative attachment to sustainability that this field kind of brings along. So just to sort of start reflecting a little bit on, why has it been quite a successful kind of convergence between transitions and spatial perspectives. First of all, I think that has to do with the fact that there has been sort of a bidirectional crossover. What a lot of our geographers tend to do is we sort of borrow from other social sciences and not necessarily sort of contribute so strongly back to those other disciplines. While here, geographers, particularly economic geographers, found a lot of value in sort of the frameworks, the concepts from transition studies to make sense of the greening of global economy, but at the same time kind of giving back a better understanding of why transitions unfold in certain places and not others. That has been of interest to transition studies. Why I kind of argue quite strongly against, transdisciplinarity is anything goes, is that a lot of quite high quality sort of theory development happened because transition studies and especially evolutionary economic geography shared epistemologies and theoretical foundations. For example, in thinking in terms of how do we theorize firm behavior? How do we theorize the role of institutions, norms and values, and so on? Then there has been, of course, the normative allure that a lot of people feel that they need to contribute to sustainable development, if not only just sort of understanding and explaining, whether it is possible, how it could be possible, but also kind of actively engaging with making it possible. But obviously also what has played an important role is external incentives. A lot of funding is nowadays geared to missions related to sustainability, to climate change, etc., etc. But also that there's perhaps a certain recognition in terms of making a contribution to society when you are dealing with topics like sustainability, transitions, innovation, and that is considered to be societally impactful research. Now, how am I doing in time? All right. Going to the point about, so how can we then govern those transitions, and how can we govern the innovations that are needed for those transitions? What this literature very much emphasizes is that it happens through experimentation. And again, that is something that has become very much picked up by policymakers and practitioners. Going to that niche level in the multi-level perspective, what transition theory argues is that you need to protect, shield those very early, premature innovations, technologies. You need to nurture them in terms of developing the technology, but also developing how they are being brought into practice. And often those technologies then meet barriers in terms of regulations, in terms of resistance against change. So it's also then about the institutional work, changing norms, values, empowering those niches to become transformative and to mainstream. More recently, what has also been recognized, what is happening in those niches is contestation. It is not only about working with the willing and with those that want to advocate and promote those innovations, but also understanding what's the pushback, what's the criticism against those innovations. And that idea of experimentation in niches very much focuses on the local scale as the designated scale where experimentation happens. And this has in a sense been picked up by a lot of cities. Looking at the C40s of this world, what they do is basically fostering a lot of climate experimentation. Experimenting with climate and, more broadly, sustainability solutions. But C40 is probably the most well-known example. The example I've worked with, the Rockefeller Foundation, 100 Resilient Cities, is another example. But we also see it at the EU level with city collaborations. What they're basically doing is experimenting with climate actions, climate innovation, sustainability, across a range of different cities, and let 1,000 flowers bloom, and basically trying to find, experiment which innovations are fit for purpose. That is happening at the meso-macro level, while what is happening on the more micro level within cities is that those experiments are organized really as processes where you're constantly generating and iteratively refining a solution concept, be it nature-based solutions, be it car-free zones, be it passive housing, and where you're constantly also sort of testing those innovations in practice in order to sort of receive continuous feedback. And we see that sort of the idea that we need to sort of experiment to make a transition has picked up in the transition literature, and has been kind of popularized by the notion of living labs. I'll continue with that in a bit. But also within the urban literature, people like Harriet Bulkley talk about how cities are doing governance experiments, how sort of climate urbanism, or sort of the responses by cities to climate change, are often by sort of doing interventions, actions, with the imperative to basically just learn, innovate, gain experience, right? Recognizing that climate change and a lot of sustainability challenges are wicked problems. But we see that the whole sort of the experimentation sort of vocabulary also spilled over to something called like the public sector innovation labs, where governments are sort of setting up experiments and labs, realizing that sort of the way that they've been addressing problems often sort of fall within silos, and that sort of traditional government structures are unable to resolve a lot of the contemporary pressing societal challenges. And what they do is then to set up so-called public sector innovation labs. Again, testing and trialing, innovating responses, solutions forward. So what are the transformative promises of those experiments? Well, they're supposed to be radical. It's about innovating with radical solutions. They are targeting real challenges, real problems. They are not sort of laboratories or experiments in the sense that they're in closed settings, but rather that they have very open-ended outcomes. They are supposed to be very mobilizing, and that goes to the idea that they are transdisciplinary, are impact-oriented, are supposed to also engage, bring along citizens, policymakers, other stakeholders in the innovation learning process. They are strategic. They serve a long-term ultimate goal of sustainability. But there's also an interesting sort of conundrum there that those experiments are very ephemeral. They're small scale, often quite lightly resourced, short-term actions, right? So the idea of governing through experiments sets up very ambitious goals and objectives, but tries to do that with relatively light touch sort of policy interventions. So that brings us to living labs, which has become also one of those kind of policy buzzwords, magic concepts. It's a sort of in a way, a very policy-friendly translation of doing experiments, where the idea is that you innovate around a energy, housing, transport solution in collaboration between public sector, private sector, knowledge institutions, but also citizens and users. And rather than seeing citizens and users as sort of passive recipients of innovation, right? The idea of a living lab is that you kind of enroll, you include citizens into the innovation process, both in terms of coming up with ideas, in terms of problem framing, but also in terms of evaluating those solutions that might come out of that living lab. And so how typically a living lab sort of exercise would be conducted would be that it starts off with sort of real challenges, congestion, pollution, you name it, involving then sort of a broad range of stakeholders to kind of ideate, explore, conceptualize the problem and possible solutions to that. and then to basically in the real world sort of experiment with those solutions. Not with this sort of the idea that, well, if we include those stakeholders and citizens, we'll kind of get greater buy-in, but it is also to with the philosophy that the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and we can really sort of further improve those innovations if we do it in a kind of co-creative way. And plus also to open up sort of the evaluation of those experiments and innovations to the preferences, to the evaluation criteria of the people that are using it, but the people also that are being affected by it. So in Lund, we did a project, the EU project, on urban living labs, and looking at different countries: Sweden, UK, Austria, Netherlands. And in that project, we also sort of found that there's quite some variety in terms of how those living labs kind of manifest themselves. You have the typical sort of strategic living labs, which are typically managed by, initiated by large, well-resourced actors, government, large corporations. You can think about smart cities, you can think about driverless vehicles, where those kind of technologies, innovations are being tested, are exposed to the real world, often with sort of the idea that we want to scale up those technologies. Then you would have what we would call civic urban living labs, which are more about sort of local development, placemaking, again, often sort of led by municipalities or public sector organizations, but often in collaboration also with universities. But there it is more about really sort of transforming a place. There you could think about the way that cities have been experimenting with opening up for more bicycling, and how that is sort of changing urban structures. But importantly also, a third sort of type is the living labs that really emerged through grassroots organizations, through NGOs, which often were sort of the most radical kind, right? Those could be like, community energy initiatives, urban gardening, radical in idea, but often not very well resourced, and sort of difficult to scale and to sort of take into the mainstream. Now, this brings me then to sort of where I started to work in transdisciplinary. And that is when I engaged with the City of Melbourne in this chair of resilient cities, which was a project within this strategy, which kind of originated through the 100 Resilient Cities initiative by the Rockefeller Foundation. City of Melbourne applied to become part of that network, and in their sort of plan, they also written into it that there would be a chair, a connection to the university, to do action research on the development and implementation of that strategy. I was very interested in that position because I thought that's a great way to leverage impact, right? And they were keen not to sort of have a planner in that role, but in the recruitment process, they were very much looking for people with a sort of an interdisciplinary background. At the same time, I was very surprised because in my previous research, I had never really dealt with the topic explicitly of resilience. But apparently that was not that big of an issue because they were primarily interested in sort of, how can we mobilize, concepts, theories of innovation to do action research on the implementation of this strategy. So to me, this also sort of very much fit the bill of, this is an experimentalist sort of governance around sustainability or resilience. And in a sense, they followed a lot of the theory of the philosophy that, when they started developing this strategy, they did a lot of consultation with citizens, with different organizations in the city of Melbourne to identify what are the key sort of resilience challenges for our city. Is that something to do with, climate change and bushfires and extreme weather events? As a result, they made a sort of a long list of resilience challenges, both acute shocks and chronic stresses. And that, was very, very diverse. It also included, increasing social inequality, rapid population growth that Melbourne is experiencing, and so on. But then, as a sort of an outcome of that sort of problem identification, they've had about 20 or so, between 15 and 20 projects that were supposed to sort of further resilience in Melbourne. And it kind of made sense to conceptualize those projects as living labs. Because they typically involved, it was very much kind of collaboration based. It involved the municipality, but also private firms. It involved universities. It involved civic organizations, NGOs, and so on. And it was very much about sort of, implementing these projects, innovating, and learning from those projects along the way. That's when also kind of I became a bit less naive, a bit more skeptical about living labs and experimentation. I'll start wrapping up. I'm nearly there. Because a lot of these, right, I'll go to this one. What happened with a lot of these living labs was that they basically became projectified. So they became projects in their own right, which were very much about delivering and implementing the project as such. And it was very much sort of about making sure that we live up to our aims for the next 2-3 years and try to find more resources and find more support to continue our project. But also the way that those living labs were sort of held accounted was with a very much emphasis on controlling the operations, doing things in kind of cost-efficient ways. As a result of those kind of living labs experiments starting to live more life as projects, a lot of the radicalness kind of got toned down, and it became more sort of unambitious incrementalism. It was about privileging the achievable rather than the necessary, and it was often very sort of reproductive of existing structures rather than challenging structures and knowledge systems. So citizens were involved, but it was often more in the form of quite tokenistic counseling. So rather than sort of exploring a problem and exploring solutions to that problem, so the solutions started to run ahead of the problem, right? So it became what people have started to call solutionism. Framing of the problem diagnosis is actually subject to what is available in terms of often technological solutions looking for a problem. And moreover, what happened was that a lot of those experiments kind of suffered from challenges around organized irresponsibility. Because there was so much collaboration going on, there were so many stakeholders involved, no one was anymore really held accountable or responsible for the outcomes and continuity of the efforts except for sort of the project manager. So this really kind of also, this really made it difficult to sort of look at these experiments in living labs as learning exercises. To start wrapping up, experimentation, urban living labs are probably very kind of popularized sort of notions of how to do transdisciplinarity. It is very much about, you know, engaging as a scientist, as a researcher, with stakeholders in society, to co-create with them. But sort of my sometimes painful sort of experiences from Melbourne were also that really requires social trust between those different actors. Trust which was often lacking, at least in the Australian context. In theory, experiments and living labs are about trial and error. It's a lot about learning from failure. But at least, again, the Australian context was not an institutional context that was particularly conducive to learning from failure. But it was a lot about reporting success, reporting innovation, reporting novelty, breakthrough, etc., etc. Then you kind of, you know, that idea that there was organized irresponsibility. You basically just had a quite chaotic ecosystem of projects that were not really sort of learning from each other, that were not sort of providing lessons for or provided learning opportunities for policymakers, for planners, for politicians. But to actually monitor and evaluate those experiments and living labs really requires explicit institutional capacity and resources. So to argue also for, or to draw attention for the fact that transdisciplinarity has its benefits if it's done well, but that's probably a very resourceful and time-consuming process. But we see also a lot of bad transdisciplinarity happening in the sense that, you know, those experiments, those living labs, could easily also be used for hand-waving or ceremonial purposes, right? To say, well, we've got a living lab around biking, or we've got a living lab around co-housing, while in Melbourne, nobody wanted to touch the public transport system, right? So we had a lot of experience about how can we foster mobility as a service, how can we create mobility platforms, blah, blah, blah. But the Resilient Melbourne strategy did not touch public transport planning or expansion. But it showed nice kind of visuals around the innovative stuff that was happening in terms of doing mobility innovations. So this leads also to a kind of a paradox around experimentation and urban living labs as something political or post-political. So on the one hand, it suggests that we engage and include citizens more in innovation experimentation processes, that we open up for, you know, contestation, but also, you know, involvement in idea creation, problem framing, and so on and so on. But at the same time, it seems that it's often the usual suspects that join in those living labs. So it also kind of is criticized for remaining rather technocratic rather than political. So to finish off with some reflections on a transdisciplinary episode, and here I draw a bit on a paper by colleagues in Bergen at the University of Bergen, by Håvard Harstad and colleagues, who wrote a very nice piece about transformative social science, and argue, you know, there are pitfalls and there are opportunities for doing transformative social science or doing transdisciplinary social science. Pitfalls is if you become a spokesperson for a cause, and I could clearly see when I was working with the City of Melbourne that I could become a spokesperson for how innovative and how sustainable and how green the City of Melbourne is by celebrating all their innovations, living labs and experiments. It's also important to think about, to what end do you co-create, do you engage other stakeholders? Often it is also just seen as an end in itself, rather than a means to achieve something. So just because you have engaged with the citizens doesn't necessarily mean that you've done that in a meaningful, transformative way. And then there's also the pitfall that you can just become very critical and cynical about, we need to focus more on impact and engagement, but often then sort of stay entrenched within a relatively small sort of echo chamber of critical scholarship. So what they argue are sort of opportunities for doing transdisciplinary research well is when you're able to translate knowledge into knowledge about understanding and explaining phenomena into something actionable, if you provide, not necessarily having to do the actions yourself, but providing suggestions about how knowledge can be turned into action. It could help to critically reframe discourses, and in that sense, at least sort of my experiences with Melbourne was that it helped to reframe the idea of innovation as not just something that is a technological fix, but which was very prevalent in Australia at that time, but as something that is deeply relational, that can be very mundane, but which is very much about collaboration and all that. And finally, it is also just about, as researchers, that you are in the practice of constantly connecting actors and processes. So especially the third one is perhaps maybe a more mundane, but still very valuable sort of contribution in terms of doing transdisciplinary research. Apologies for going over time, but I'll leave it there, and I look forward to questions. Thank you.